Welcome, everybody, to our session on using PBIS to ensure racial equity in school discipline. My name is Kent McIntosh. I am co-director of the Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, and I have the extreme privilege to be able to present with Dr. Nicole Holland-Sims from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. We're going to talk through for our session here, and we hope you get a lot of good information out of what we share. We are just super excited about the chance to share at this conference. It's a really important one and a great place for focus on equity of all sorts. In particular, we're going to be talking about racial equity in school discipline. I want to start with some acknowledgements. First, although this is a virtual conference, I am sitting at the University of Oregon, and the University of Oregon is located on Kalapuya Lihi, which is the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya peoples. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, the Kalapuya peoples were dispossessed of their traditional homeland and forcibly removed to the coast reservations in Western Oregon. Today, members of the Kalapuya, or descendants of the Kalapuya, are members of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde and Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians, and continue to make important contributions to our area, to the state of Oregon, and to the world. I also want to thank our federal sponsors, including OSEP and OESE, and as well National Center for Special Education Research from IES that I'll be sharing a little bit of information. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge the equity work group of the Center on PBIS. We have been around for going on 8 years now doing this work. And although the members around the table have changed a little bit over time, this group has been really, really important in increasing the quality and the cultural responsiveness of the work that we're doing and what we're going to be able to share with you.
And so as we think about today's session, we really want to take some time and go over some important pieces of equity and discipline. So number one, we're going to share effects of PBIS on disciplinary equity. And Kent's going to talk about the great things that PBIS can do for school systems. But we're also going to think about introduction to an equity-focused PBIS approach to ensure that whatever we are providing from a systems level lens, that with that, there's equity embedded in everything that we do. And lastly, we want to share some resources for increasing racial equity in school discipline. And we know that resources are highly valued in the work that everyone does. And so we want to be sure that we leave you with some tangible things that you can do tomorrow.
Thanks. So I probably don't need to describe to you all the long-standing, as long as we've been collecting federal data on inequities in school discipline. They have been there and they have been persistent. And I'm going to share with you some federal data. These come from the Civil Rights Data Collection database. This is some of the more recent, but not fully recent data looking at out-of-school suspension risk index, which basically just means the percent of students from each group who have been suspended out of school at least once during the 2013-14 school year. And if you look across the bottom, you can see, or if you start actually on the left side, you can see all students, that left side 5%, meaning that 1 in 20 students was suspended out of school at least once, K-12, across US schools. But you can see that that risk is not evenly distributed. And so you can see if you look right into the middle, Black or African American students are the most exposed to exclusionary discipline and out-of-school suspensions. And the next group is students with disabilities. And of course, when we start talking about and thinking about intersectionality, the suspension rate for Black students with disabilities would go all the way off of this chart because of that compounding risk that we see. So many educators, including Dr. Holland-Sims and I, have been really motivated to try to make this change on a really broad level. And a lot of schools are implementing PBIS, or positive behavioral interventions and supports, to be able to not only make schools more safe, predictable, and positive, but also more equitable as well. What you can see here is this is schools implementing PBIS over the years, and that one on the right is the 1920 school years. This is our most current data. We'll get some new numbers in the next little bit. But what you can see is even in this global health pandemic that we've had, more schools than ever are implementing PBIS. Almost a third of schools in the country supporting over 15 million students. And that number just continues to go up over time. And one of the reasons for that is that if schools implement PBIS with fidelity, they are likely to see these really, really important outcomes. Reduced problem behavior, reduced use of exclusionary discipline in schools, including those suspensions, as I was describing before, increased pro-social behavior, social skills use, increased social emotional competence, improved academic achievement, improved perceptions of school safety, and also improved organizational health. So also some adult outcomes. And then I also want to share with you some outcomes for PBIS in high schools. So you can see this. These numbers are, the research base is a little bit smaller, but it really is emerging. You can see over the past few years, reduced use of exclusionary discipline, reduced alcohol and other drug use, improved attendance, and improved student engagement.
And so as we think about the information that Kent just described, looking at high schools, for instance, and the things that can come out of implementing PBIS with fidelity, we know how important that is for engagement, for students to want to remain in school and complete it. Pedro Noguera, who is one of the, I would say, premier people in the equity work, gave the following quote, which resonates so much with me. If you ran a hospital, but you were only known for serving people who are healthy, well, then you wouldn't be a very good hospital. And I think as we consider those outcomes of PBIS that we know can happen when done with fidelity, we have to be clear that it's reaching all of the people that we want it to. And there are still some groups of students that are not getting what they need. And that's why equity in discipline in particular is so important, so that those outcomes that we just saw are available and accessible to those students as well.
And I think one of the things that's really critical with PBIS is the main focus of it is building this positive school culture. And we've got to be really careful when we intentionally build a positive school culture, whether we're building something that makes all students welcome and whether we do something that makes students feel like school is for them. So this is a little bit of a humorous picture of it, but it might match, unfortunately, the status of schools and maybe even schools using PBIS. So you see a big sign in the middle that says, "Welcome home of the dogs." And then if you look below, you see the big sign policy saying "No dogs." So we've got to be really, really careful when we do this. And especially for us and me as a co-director of the center, we are really, really concerned about increasing equity. And I have heard over the years people saying anecdotally things like PBIS only works in the suburbs, or it only works for white students, or it maybe even increases discipline disparities between students of color or minoritized student groups and others. That PBIS is an agent of white supremacy. And obviously that is something that is a huge concern for me and a huge concern for many of us. And so one of the things that we did, especially as I started working more deeply and took on co-director roles, is to say, let's look at the data that we have and see whether things are actually better with PBIS in terms of equity, whether things are worse or whether things are about the same. So if you remember those blue bars that I showed you before for out of school suspension risk index that were national data, the reason why I showed you those ones that were from a few years ago is because we completed an evaluation brief looking at this. So you can see the blue bar on the left is all schools in the country. It's over 95,000 schools. And if you remember that all students, that 5% that I was describing, are 1 in 20. If you look at the green columns, those green columns are schools that are implementing PBIS with adequate fidelity of implementation using a validated measure. And so if we start on the left side, you can see, okay, 5% nationally, and then 4% for schools using PBIS. So that's a 20% reduction in out of school suspension. That's nice. But as you can see, the differences are not even all the way across. And so you see that where the green bar is lower, that means that there are fewer students receiving out of school suspensions. And so you can see that bar is lower for Black students, that bar is lower for multiracial students, and it's lower for Pacific Islander students. And then that question of, does it only work for white students? If you look all the way on the right side, white students are no more or less likely to be suspended in schools using PBIS than not. So the decreases that we see nationwide in out of school suspensions are primarily for, as you can see, Black, multiracial, and Pacific Islander students, not white students. Now, one of the things that I think is really important is I look at this picture, and this is not a high five moment for me. This is not a like, yay, we've solved everything. This is a 2% reduction if you look for Black students in out of school suspension rates. But what it tells us, or at least tells me, is that at the very least, it's not making PBIS is not making things worse. It's not that PBIS only works for white students, but yet it's not the outcomes that we want to see, right? It's a little bit better, but not nearly as effective in terms of decreasing that discipline gap than we want. So some research teams have actually looked and said, are there parts of PBIS that are more related to racial equity in school discipline? And this is particularly between Black students and all other students, or Black and white students. These two separate research teams using two separate samples, even separate fidelity of implementation measures, looked and found a few things of PBIS, few critical features, were more related to equity in school discipline. Number one, teams that use their data for decision-making more often were more likely to have equity in school discipline. Number two, teams that implemented PBIS in classrooms, not just common areas around the school, more likely to see equity in school discipline, and also actually more likely to have reduced use of overall exclusionary discipline and increased sustainability of implementation too. So if you are implementing in schools or supporting schools that are implementing, it is absolutely critically important that they're using classroom systems, not just non-classroom. And then the third one, which both research teams found, is that the greater implementation of formal reward or acknowledgement systems, so we're talking about systems for recognizing students when they do things that we want them to do, had greater equity in school discipline. That is across multiple states, across different samples in there. And so what that tells us is we've spent a bunch of time talking about the discipline gap. We may very well be seeing an acknowledgement gap where we're actually not providing these evidence-based practices of behavior-specific praise, possibly also opportunities to respond, things that we know are absolutely critical. Maybe we're not providing those equitably across student groups. And so when I think about this, I go back to my English teaching days, and one of the authors who really spoke to me was Alex Haley, author of Roots, and also the sort of ghost author of the autobiography of Malcolm X. when he was talking about his writing, and this really resonated with me. He said, in my writing, as much as I could, I tried to find the good and praise it, right? When we look for that behavior that we want to see and acknowledge it, we're going to see it more often. So taking that research that I just shared and our practice experience and other research over time, the center has developed, and you can go to the PBIS.org, the equity topic page, and see all of our free resources for increasing equity in school discipline. And most of these fit under this large approach of talking about what are the most important things we can do to increase racial and ethnic equity in school discipline. And because this is a complex problem, there is not going to be any one solution that is going to fix it all. Instead, our research and our experience tells us that there are 5 best bets for doing that.
And Ken, I'm really excited that you're talking about these 5 best bets, because in Pennsylvania, we've been able to work with a lot of school districts around these 5. And number 1 is to collect, use, and report keyword disaggregated discipline data. You can look at your aggregate and come up with some actions and some solutions. But remember, we said we want to know if the hospital is serving everyone. The only way for us to do that is to get that disaggregated data, to drill it down and figure out which groups are not getting what they need to be successful in our settings. And so that's crucial. If your systems, your data systems are able to provide that, that's a necessary piece. Number 2 is to implement a behavior framework that is preventive, multi-tiered, and culturally responsive, a la PBIS. PBIS is that tiered framework. It creates the lever for equity to live. Again, in Pennsylvania, our definition really speaks to giving students what they need at that right moment. And that right moment is in a tiered structure when done, again, with fidelity and through a culturally responsive mindset. So ensuring that there's relevance there and connection for the people that we're supporting. Number 3 ties directly into that: use of engaging academic instruction to reduce the opportunity gap. It's really important to think about what Kent just highlighted, that acknowledgement gap that might also be there. So those increasing opportunities to respond, building and priming background knowledge, using explicit instruction, giving feedback. Those are critical practices that are so important for that engagement to happen. And we know that when students are not academically engaged, behaviors tend to go up because there's boredom or there's not a relevance for them. So we want to have that happen. Number 4, develop policies with accountability for disciplinary equity. We know that policy drives practice. And so we have to have policies that are very explicit about what it is that we look to do and what we want to see as it relates to equitable discipline. It can't simply be a non-discriminatory statement. That's a statement in and of itself. We need the action to be very much outlined in those policies that we develop. And number 5, I love this one: teach strategies to neutralize implicit bias. Whether we agree on this or not, we all have implicit biases. They're things that we may not even be aware of. That's why they're implicit, right? So as we think about the things that we encounter, the people that we encounter, automatically we have associations going on in our brain that tells us certain messages to think about when we see these actions or these people in front of us. We need strategies to help us check that thinking. And one of those is neutralizing routines. And they need to be brief, if then, doable, and they can be individual, they can be team based. So if you're in a grade level team, you could have your own grade level team neutralizing routine. And it would say that if this behavior occurs, these are the steps that we are going to take to ensure that we don't make quick, irrational decisions that could ultimately, unfortunately, lead to disproportionate outcomes for certain groups of students. So these 5 points are super critical to this work and can be easily thought about in your next steps as you move forward. And so as we think about what I just highlighted and now sort of putting it all together, we joke that this is the refrigerator magnet of PBIS. So we all have it sort of tattooed somewhere to remind us of how important it is to keep all of these pieces connected and intersecting. Equity, as you can see, lives directly in the center. It has to. It has to drive everything that we do. The outcomes that we hope to achieve are high expectations for each student. But we have to get there through some guideposts, through a journey, right? So, in order to do that, we have to begin with that data. What was number one in our 5 points, right? It was that being able to look at disaggregated data. So, right there is one of those key components. The next piece is systems, and that's really focusing on us as adults. So, what can we do at the systems level to bring about significant shift? And that typically begins with professional learning. And that's for any educator, no matter who is in front of a child, whether that's the cafeteria worker, whether that is the school secretary, whether that is the teacher, the principal, you name it. We all need a form of professional learning to really help us embrace cultural humility. And culture is very broad when I say that. So even though our focus is racial equity, cultural humility says that I don't know Kent's background, Kent doesn't know my background, but I'm willing to learn about Kent, and I'm humble enough to know that I won't know it all. That's a form of professional learning that can be done through coaching as well as our traditional methods. And then lastly, when we have those pieces kind of all together intersecting, we see the practices are informed. And with that informed practice, we're now adapting those practices based on what we've learned about the different groups that we're serving. And we're meeting the needs, and we're also respecting the values of the people we're serving, whether that's students and or staff or communities.
That was great. I wanted to add one thing. You've probably seen a lot this word equity being thrown around the last 15 months. And it's really important when somebody does something like slaps equity in the middle of their refrigerator magnet, you better be able to ask them, what does that really mean? And is that really driving what you're doing? Or was that something that felt good in the moment to be able to add? And I think you ought to be a little skeptical of us just sharing this information without being able to share with you research. And so the good news is we have, over the past few years, a great deal of new research, primarily case studies showing how this can be done. And in early childhood education settings, so from our colleagues at NCPMI, some of the work that we've done at the PBIS Center and some other projects all the way through. We're really excited that this 5-point approach, this equity-focused approach, actually does seem to be increasing equity more than that little bit that I was sharing before. And so I wanted to share with you one particular study that we've just completed, and this is with research funding from the National Center for Special Education Research from IES. We did a 1-year professional development intervention for all staff in a school implementing PBIS. And what you can see is the schools in blue are the ones who received our intervention, and then the ones in orange are the ones who got it a year later. So we can see before, they looked very similar, and then afterwards. And what you can see is this is the risk index. So this is the risk for office discipline referrals, of being sent out of the classroom for discipline challenges. So you can see pretty similar, but for our schools in the treatment group, 32% of Black students were sent to the office at least once. And then that dropped by more than half, whereas it stayed about the same for our waitlist group. And this was a tightly controlled randomized trial that was just accepted for publication. So you might be asking, well, how do we get some of this? We're implementing PBIS, but are we really doing it with an equity focus? How can we get this information? So of course, anything that we do, we share out. And I want to share with you a few resources that you can look at on your own and be able to access. So number one is our PBIS Cultural Responsiveness Field Guide. It's just been reformatted and re-released with cleaner live links. And so you can get that. It's a really, really deep dive into cultural responsiveness and picking up on those elements of cultural humility that Dr. Helen Sims described. And then going specifically within that and then some elaboration on it, We have a tool for school teams to examine, maybe with students, maybe with families, maybe with community members, their school-wide expectations or values, and that school-wide teaching matrix to be able to examine how well the system fits the strengths, needs, and values of the people who it's intending to serve, and maybe identify some of those hidden biases that we're accidentally baking into our systems. Also helping with students, making sure that when we provide that equitable acknowledgement, that we're doing it in a way that's valued by students, and students have some voice in doing that. So we have this activity called the praise preference assessment. And then Dr. Holland Sims talked about that neutralizing routine. What can you do in the moment when your snap decision might be to send a student out of the classroom, and it might be more likely to send Black students or Black male students or Black students with disabilities out of the classroom? How can we actually keep that an instructional moment? So you can look at and access those materials anytime you like. They're freely available.
And so, just to sort of recap, as you think about that tiered framework, and as we said, one of the key components of those five was to think about a behavioral tiered framework. And so, we wanted to just sort of give you some go tos as you think about next steps as to what the tiers could look like as you embed equity into all of your practices. So, when you think about tier one, that's that core, universal. Equity is tier one, really. So, it really begins at that foundational universal space. Some of the things we've already said, however, we just wanted to kind of reinforce them. We're honoring student strengths, so being asset based, focused on what they bring to the table rather than the deficit, and honoring their voice. Students are so in tune with what they want and what they need. And so, as we're building these systems, we have to keep their voice center so that we're able to know that we're making decisions that ultimately will impact them in the way that makes the most sense for them. We also need to think about that professional learning. And even though it might be difficult sometimes, self awareness is a part of that professional learning. So, as we think about those implicit biases, those things that, as Kent said, may accidentally be misinforming our system, we have to even know that that's happening. And that's that process of self awareness. And it's things as simple as, and Kent will attest to this, looking at the behaviors that you're sending office discipline referrals for. Are they subjective? So, disrespect, defiance, disruption, the things that are highly ambiguous tend to lead to some of those disproportionate outcomes. Being self aware allows us to be able to drill down and understand what might be causing some of those referrals to come to us. We need to always consider and center the families and students again when we're looking at the values and the norms that they hold. And also communities, the communities that we have around us. What are the norms there? And how can we start to interface with our community to help build out school-wide, classroom-wide expectations? And then back to that acknowledgement gap. How do we create equitable acknowledgement systems that, again, utilize the voice of students and communities to ensure that what we're providing is most applicable for them? At the advanced tiers, I won't take too much time here, but I just wanted to highlight that at tier two, it's an access concern. We want students to have access at that advanced tier level based on the needs that they're providing. Remember, we said it has to be at that right moment. Tier two creates that space for students in smaller groups to get a little bit more than what they're getting at tier one. And it's those increased opportunities for feedback, increased instructional opportunities, having more feedback, positive homeschool communication. Not always calling to say Johnny did something wrong, but increasing that positive communication when we catch him doing something right. Okay. And then at tier three, it's more individualized, contextualized. We're really engaging and authentically engaging families at that table to determine what are the goals we should set, what makes sense to have consistency from home to school to community. Keyword trust. At that intensive level, Families, communities, and students need to be able to trust us. We need to be able to trust them. And that is a piece of self-awareness as well. So all of these things, as we said, intersect in some way. That two-way communication, it can't be us versus them or just us talking at them being student, family, community, but how are we talking together and making shared decisions? And this last one is so critical. Limiting those assumptions about home life and family values. Simply because a family doesn't do what you did when you were a youth does not mean that the practices that they have in their home are not relevant or are important to them. So it's important that we limit those assumptions and focus on what we can do together rather than separate it. And then, as we think about significant disproportionality in discipline, particularly as it relates to special education, we hope that we've given you a nice chunk of information about the importance of focusing on disciplinary equity, because that is the way that we can start to mitigate some of these significant disproportionate outcomes that we're seeing in the field. And so here are a few things to consider as we wrap up. Policy review. Looking at your discipline policies to really see, are they explicitly tied to those equitable practices that we've highlighted previously? And if not, what can we do to start to ensure that they are? So again, a non-discriminatory statement is fine, but it's just simply not enough. Those policies have to be explicit and connected to the practices. I've talked a little bit about this. It's important for us to take an overall look at our disciplinary decisions and say, are these decisions that tend to be higher on our radar very subjective, or could be a piece of vulnerable decision points, which Kent knows all too well. As we think about vulnerable decision points, they're often as a result of implicit biases based on ambiguity. And I'll quote Kent again because I use his quote often: ambiguity is disproportionality's best friend. And it can't be more true. That is so important to remember as we think about making decisions that are equitable in nature. I can't say enough that a tiered system of support needs to reflect the whole child. So not only academics, which we know we focus on a lot, but also that behavioral component, which we've highlighted here, and then social, emotional, and trauma-informed domains. All of those create a whole child. They come to us in that space of all of those things operating together. We can't silo them out. And lastly, evaluation of overall school climate is really important for that space of belonging and dignity. Kent gave a great example of, we welcome the dogs, but the dogs are not welcome here. We want every space that our educators and that our students occupy to be a place of belonging and dignity. That's the goal of equity. At the core, it's about human dignity.
Oh, what a great way to wrap up. I want to highlight that you can get all of our resources on www.pbis.org. Come to our site, check out the equity page, and look through all of the resources that we have. It's been an absolute pleasure to get a chance to work with Dr. Holland Sims again. It's always great. If you want to get a hold of either of us, you've got our contact information here. And then lastly, I just want to thank the Office of Special Education Programs for the opportunity to share here, and thank you all for watching our session. Have a great day.